Hello, this is Mandar Kulkarni, and I welcome you all to the Agile Planet podcast. Let us start with today's episode.
Our guest today is from United States and that too from our local area, San Francisco Bay Area. Gervais or Jay Johnson is our guest today, who is a very senior Agile expert. Jay adopted Agile in the early stages in the same time when Agile Manifesto was being formulated. And he was working with IBM at that time, and he continued to be Agile and innovation expert in IBM for a long time of his career. After that stint, he has been working as a vice president in a company called Matrix Consulting, where he consults with multiple organizations. So we are lucky to have a person who has very wide and deep experience in Agile for around 40 years. And with that, I'm going to request Jay to give us some more details about his background. And Jay, before that, I want to welcome you and thank you for being participant of my podcast.
Well, thank you, Mandar. I'm very excited to be here and share some of my life with everyone. Mandar said, I've been doing this for like 40 years. So when I first started out, I started out as a software engineer. I started out coding.
Mm-hmm.
When I first started coding everything, we really didn't have a structured, methodical way to do stuff. And when others came out with that, James Martin, everyone else, we kind of latched onto that and kind of followed it because it gave us some structure. And then, some of my most exciting work was with NASA, and I wrote a lot of code for there and learned a lot from that organization. And then moved on to IBM and learned a lot from that organization too, mostly working with clients and some internal IBM work or projects. I was in the financial services area of IBM at that time, and Global Business Services, which is the consulting firm. And we mostly work with, regulatory companies, banks, insurance companies, financial companies as such. And internally in IBM, we were doing software engineering, and we were doing back in the days when XP came back and then released that. We were kind of following that way of working together. And
Mm-hmm.
and it was very different from the waterfall. It was hard for me to transition to that and the way of working there. And then when Agile Manifesto came out and Scrum came out with their way of working, it was another transition for me and change. So I went from software engineering and coding to like enterprise architecture. I was also a database DB2 guru. I really got into data. I love data. And then I went to the project management, program management route, right? And got all my certifications and, kind of ran large projects and programs. And then I went from that to XP and doing all that and kind of collaborating with the team to get the work done. And then I went from that to Scrum, and then evolved into SAFe and LESS and on all these additional frameworks. So it's been an interesting journey for me, and I'm always learning. Every time I turn around, there's some other new wonderful thing out there that someone invented, right? I can remember story mapping. We started using that. I can remember outcome-based metrics. We started using that. OKRs came out a long time ago, but now it became much more popular now. So every time I turn around, there's some neat, new, cool stuff to do and learn.
Sure. So as you are a very early adopter of Agile and Scrum, and that too for such a large organization, such a powerful organization in the world, how did you do that? In the sense, what I want to know is, whenever such a large organization wants to adopt something completely new, which is not really speaking proven in the market, what are the challenges that you faced either internally or externally with your clients when you adopted these agile methodologies, XP, Scrum, whatever methodologies you are trying to adopt?
Yeah, so in the early days, it was about really exuding confidence for the client or for their internal organizations in IBM to try something new. Because you got to remember, in the early days, okay, I can even go back when we tried to sell project management. I don't know if you all know this, but in the early days of project management, no organization said, why do we need project managers? But over time, people's thinking and how we do stuff evolved, and project managers were important. It was the same thing in the early days when we started saying, okay, we want to do iterative incremental development, and we want to break down the work, and we want to do Scrum and this way of doing stuff. It was not an easy sell. Okay, people were very skeptical. Will this work? And they would have, a list. They really would provide me a list of reasons why this would not work, right? It's not going to work here.
Oh my God, okay.
Yeah. And we would have to go through each one of those and come up with what we could do to mitigate those risks or those issues or those concerns that they would have. But it really came down to, hey, do you want to be involved in a cool, exciting experiment? It may or may not work. Okay? But do you want to go on that journey and see if we can make it work? So it really takes an executive or someone with the decision power to make that call. In the early days, that's really what it was. It was risky. Okay, so it wasn't like today where you had hundreds of people out here or thousands of people who've been there and done it before that can come into an organization and then kind of show them how they've done it and help them out. Back in the early days, there was very few people who has done this before, right? So we had to acquire the skills and the capabilities, go through the training. We would work and consult with leaders in the field at the time who had the most experience at the time, right? So if you go back to like Craig Larman and Boss Fody and some of the others, Jeff Sutton, all of them, they started early too, right? So we would borrow from them. We would go to the conferences, we'd talk to them, get their information and knowledge, and then we would practice it, right? But the key there was that we were allowed to learn, experiment, and fail and adjust, right? And then we had clear measurement. So IBM at the time was a very data-driven organization and company. So they were already there about getting facts and data, and it was a very financially driven company. Okay, which means you've got to prove that this is going to work, within 6 months or 3 months, and they've got to see the financial metrics to indicate that there's positive outcome coming out of this so they can continue it. So I'll be honest with you, I was just lucky to be working with some very smart, bright people that was very adaptive, and we just figured out how to make it work. And then we started working with our clients. It was the same thing. Our clients were very skeptical at the time, and we used what we did in IBM to go over there to a client like Nationwide Insurance, or for example, and say, well, let's try this way of doing things, and we can create like a development center, an agile Scrum center of teams, and it kind of organically grew, because what happens in my experience in organizations is once you become successful, everybody in the organization knows it. Yeah. And everyone comes to you and say, wow, we've seen all this great stuff you're doing. Not only is it a great outcome for the company, but your people seem to be happier. You have this magical work-life balance going on, right? Which is hard to attain. So they'll eventually will come to you and they'll want you to help them. So that's kind of how we've done it. We've kind of organically grown it. We learned from the experts at the time. Then we learn by doing. My philosophy is you don't have to be perfect to start doing something. Just know the fundamentals, and there's some prep work you got to do, but you're going to learn by doing it. And we're all smart people. We can figure it out and adapt.
Yeah. So I have not worked with largest company like IBM anytime, but now when you are that is becoming part of your largest experience, what one or two takeaways that you have from a larger company like IBM's experience that you earned over there? Can you say something about such a big company, what you came out with when you came out from IBM?
I think there's some things I had to learn about myself and grow. So one of them was you have to be patient. With large complex organization, change does not happen quickly usually. It's large, complex organization. You have to be patient, and you have to keep working at it. Okay. The other thing I think works well is having a plan, and I call it implementation plan. So a lot of people call them roadmaps today, but I go down to the next level of detail. It's not a project plan. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
But it's like, how are we going to do this very practically and pragmatic, if you will? How are we going to implement? What teams are we going to start with? So I always look at, and this hasn't changed over the years, which is kind of funny. I always look at 3 levels of an organization design that we have to do. The first level is what I call strategic investment. So these are generally the executives. They're the leaders. They have to make decisions about running a company and what they're going to invest in, the budget, so forth, et cetera. And there are certain techniques and practices they can use to be objective, because usually it's the most powerful, loudest person gets their way, right? And we try to avoid that. Then the second layer of the organization we looked at is kind of like the product layer, the product area, and the product line, but it's all product nowadays. Everything's centralized around the product. Even the new version of Scaled Agile Framework, version 5, has really, now identified it's all about the product as well as the team. So now at the product layer, then we have certain operational models we do there, certain organizational design that they have to make certain decisions and help make sure that the flow of work comes to the teams. And then we have the team layer, like the Scrum teams, the Kanban teams, or whatever, the teams that are doing the work, the coding and testing. Now that's evolved. So remember, when this first started, it was all the technology and software world, but now it's moving to the business side of the house where they're doing Scrum and Agile. Sometimes there's no code at the end, right? Yeah. But we're using some of the same techniques, some of the same ways of thinking, ways of working, and practices, right? So those same layers can work, right? So now in big companies like IBM, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, all these big companies, these layers add a level of complication. Okay, this is just so big. And then you have the management layer. So this is the hardest thing for change in an organization moving to Agile Scrum, is that the management layer now no longer has the power to pull people from a project to another project, because there's eventually no projects. But in big companies, they still have projects. That's how they work. Okay, but we're trying to slowly evolve over time to creating these autonomous teams, and you fund the product, right? And the teams stay together for the life of the product. You don't move people around. Of course, people move every now and then, of course, but it's not like the project management days, right? Yeah. And that's a hard change for large organizations, right? And the managers, now they are having to do something else or different. There's a lot of work to do, don't get me wrong, right? But that resource management and stuff, that changing is difficult for us. So I've learned patience. You've got to take them on a journey. You've got to give them something to do. So if you're going to take something away from them, you've got to give them something else, right?
True.
Of importance and value to do for the organization. So big companies, I would say the big difference between big companies, especially regulated industries where you have compliance and audit and regulatory things you have to take care about and risk, is that it's more complicated and more complex. So what sometimes, I hate to say this, sometimes what you read in a book and learn what another company is doing does not apply one for one to these big complicated organizations. You're going to have to adjust accordingly. So that's what I've kind of learned.
Sure. I like that. Patience, and that really stands out everywhere whenever you are really looking at organizational transformation. The things don't happen overnight. That's very true. Very true. Let's move to the another topic. Now you are working as a consulting industry, consulting with multiple organizations, large and small. And we all have in Agile, we have seen that there is a significant amount of various frameworks coming up, right from layers to safe and disciplined Agile and all that. Do you want to compare, or in your opinion, which are the most effective? I would not say you say that as a prescription, but in your opinion, what type of framework has worked best in your opinion, in your experience?
I think it's the framework that the company develops themselves works the best. So
it's
where's
completely different thought.
Yes. So here's my experience, and I've implemented SAFe and LESS and DAD and all of those to some degree. SAFe probably has the largest footprint. It's out in most organizations, but I would argue that most organizations modified it and adjusted it for their needs. Okay.
True.
And SAFe is, to me, okay, but it's kind of complicated. And I know Dean Leffingwell and them are doing well, and a lot of companies, organizations like it. I think they like it because it's not requiring them to make significant organizational design and changes. They still at the program level, the team level, the portfolio level, a lot of the project program management discipline, words and thinking. Okay. They have this notion of a release train. Well, it's really if you think about it, it's a program.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a program.
Yeah. So for many companies, that's kind of an easier absorption for change. That's kind of like an incremental change, right?
Sure.
Compared to large-scale Scrum, LESS, Boss Vody and Craig Larman are very vocal about you have to have complete organization change and design. You shouldn't have any project managers or program managers in your So they're very vocal about significant, comprehensive change, right? So not every company is going to feel they could do that, nor do they want to buy into that, right? So, and there's others. Discipline Agile is more like a cafeteria. You pick and choose, and it has all this cool stuff that you can pick from, and it includes other things that you need to do. So Scrum is good, but it doesn't include change management. It doesn't include that product layer, product discovery. Marty Kagan, I like his idea of product discovery and product delivery, and how you have to synchronize those two. Scrum doesn't include that notion to that degree of detail. Mind the product school. So the product discipline now is a major discipline out there. There's thousands and thousands of people throughout the world. That's their career, right? Right. Scrum Master, same thing. That's a major discipline right there, right? Cloud, all that stuff on the technology side is, of course, too. But now I've noticed that from a framework perspective, Scrum is by far is out there. More companies and people are doing that in any framework, right? And it's now celebrated 25 years.
That's true.
And and I always made a joke, anything that's over 20 years is probably no longer valid and old. Well, see, they proved me wrong. Proved me wrong. We're still out there doing it. So I see that if we can take these the fundamental changes, and I call them the mechanics, the team mechanics, how we work together operationally, mechanically, people tend to do that really well. And I like integral agile. I don't know if anyone's ever heard about that, but you can look it up. And that we look at these, if you will, 4 quadrants. One is we're going to put Jira out there. We're going to do these Scrum events. We're agile. Well, not really, because then we've got to hook up the mindset and the way of thinking, because that's different, right? So it's behavior, it's organization leadership and how they lead, right? And then the next quadrant we kind of pull together is what we call the organizational structure. To me, organization drives culture. So how you design your organization with a Conway rule and everything else, and software and communication, it's important we focus on that. And then the last quadrant is generally the outside world. We think outside in nowadays. So now, how do we deal with our suppliers, our vendors? How do they become part of this agile ecosystem? What we try to do nowadays, from a framework perspective, as we take, safe or less, whatever, we make it work. We might adjust it, pick pieces of parts. XP is still out there. I mean, I argue DevOps and CI/CD, that all came from XP. It's just gotten better over time, right? But we take those things and we kind of orchestrate around that agile ecosystem, and we pick what works for us, right? And then we adjust accordingly, and it evolves and adapts over time, because new stuff, new changes is always going to happen, and we've got to be able to adapt, right?
Yeah.
And I really believe in the Kanban framework too. I use that a lot to make decisions and to determine what practices and tools we use, whether it's for the complicated domain or the complex domain, because it's very different on how we handle complex domain. Complex domain, there's too many unknowns. There's a lot of sensitive response, everything else you do. That's more product discovery, probing, figuring things out, right? Most of us in the industry or in most corporations work in the complicated and the simple domain, right? The complex domain is much more difficult to work in, because you're really on the cutting edge.
Right. So these 4 quadrants that you talked about, I missed the name of that framework. What's the name of that framework?
It's called the integral frame. It's the integral framework, I think it is. It's Michael Spade and them created that. I think they call it a different name now. They have another company. But it is. I think if you do a Google search on the Agile Integral framework, or it'll pop up.
Okay. Agile Integral framework. Okay. Great. Jay, my next question to you is: we talked about 3 layers of organizations where they need to be changed if any organization needs to be transformed. Executives, middle management, and team. And in my experience, what I've realized is any agile consultant, agile coach, he definitely has to bring in the new processes, but he has to really be very skillful in managing what is called as a resistance. And that resistance sometimes is very, very upfront, or sometimes it's very subtle. And you have to really be very careful about how you handle that resistance, so that you can show some good progress made with the philosophies, the processes that you are bringing in. Do you have any insights about how to handle the resistance?
Yeah, so this is where, and I really believe this, is that not all of us have the same skills and capabilities. Okay, we're all different. Okay.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, to do this agile transformation well, you have to have really good interpersonal skills. You have to have really good political skills and this thing they call emotional IQ, right? Because you're going to need it. Okay? This is about people, human beings, and changing human behavior and ways of thinking. They're, thinking that you know the best way, and the types of words you use, the tone you use, how you interact with people, how you know who to go interact with. Okay, all makes a difference because people use that word servant leader a lot, but it's more than that. This is if you really think about it, you're becoming an adept politician.
Wow.
That's what you're doing.
Yes.
So you have to know every individual. You'll get to know them and their personalities. You'll get to know what's in it for them, right? And how and what. Okay, Sally has a problem with Joe. Okay, and they don't get along. Okay, well, why? What's going on, right? Because I need Sally and Joe to get along, right?
True.
Now, I've had situations through this work where I had to talk to executives and people, and we had to replace people, or we had to put people on other work inside the company because they just weren't going to change. And I've had a couple of people who actually tried to sabotage the work and the effort, and they were caught. All right. So decisions had to be made, right? So I'm just saying these things will happen. If you're going to really be successful at this, I think the capabilities and skills you need in the interpersonal world and the politics world and the emotional world is of more value than the skills in Scrum, the skills in Jira. I mean, they're important. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
We need people to do that. But if you want to work up here with the leadership of an organization and the management of the organization and help enact positive change going forward, then you're going to need the interpersonal skills and the politics.
Sure. Absolutely. I cannot agree with you more than this, because ultimately, if you do not have enough and right kind of emotional intelligence, then the life is going to be very difficult. It's a people's world.
Right. And what's weird, I'll share with you my life experience. When I started out as a software engineer, I was an introvert. I really didn't like people. So I like being on my own, and I didn't really like interacting and doing any of that stuff that I do today. Over time, life presents things to you, right? And you're either going to be attracted to it and learn it and do well, or you're not, and you're going to go off and learn this, right? I chose this way, and so far it's been okay.
Absolutely. I want to touch base upon two things which are related and kind of on the periphery. Okay. So first thing is, in your jobs, in your name itself on LinkedIn, when I look at it and your description, there is a very strong presence of a word innovation, which is part of your title as well. And in my opinion, or whatever I understand, this word has got so many different shades and meanings to everybody. How do you understand innovation? What can you simplify innovation for us and tell us in the agile context that what innovation means?
Yeah, so innovation to me, and if you go out there and research it, there's different types of innovation, but it's basically coming up with an idea or an invention, but you make it usable to the market or to the people. So it's something that makes a difference. And people start using, like the iPhone. iPhone is a great innovation, right? So to me, that's innovation. So companies now, really to survive, you have to be innovative.
Mm.
Okay. And you have to be the leader of innovation in your industry. If not, you're not going to last very long. That's just the way it is today. So I kind of leaned towards that over the years. So over the years, like I said, software engineering, project management, doing the practical stuff, Scrum, now helping with, change, authorization of Agile. But now I really focus a lot on innovation. It's like, cool, we'll get the delivery going, get the Scrum teams up, we're going to get all this work done. But what are you innovating? What are you bringing to the market that's going to change the market or change the customer, right? So what new product or service that you're going to do or provide that disrupts, right? Okay. So I work with companies to help figure that out. And there's certain practices and tools we do, but it's a different way of thinking. Now here in the Bay Area where you live and I live, there's a lot of startups, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of startups that die and we step over them on the street, right? Because not every startup lasts very long. But they all are about innovation. So when they get together and that the real, I won't say real, but there's a difference between what Scrum calls a product owner, product manager, and what the startups do from a product owner, product manager, and what the product school and others mind the product does. Okay, they're not writing user stories, okay, and stuff. They're coming up with, how am I going to create this new product with this team? They own the product from birth to death, how it's going to get out to the market, how they're going to do certain things to evaluate whether the customer is going to buy it, and so forth, and constantly adapting and evolving, right? And they kind of lead the charge on that particular product, right? That's innovation. And what's happened is a lot of big companies tried to emulate that. So what did they do? Instead of creating innovation inside the company, they create a separate innovation lab and hired a bunch of people to go up there and invent stuff like, okay, how are we going to make cars drive themselves? Here's a team, go figure that out, right? SpaceX, I mean, how are we going to launch vehicles, space vehicles up, and then take the launching vehicle and capture it back and save it and use it again? I mean, look, NASA many, many years ago, as I worked there, we never would have dreamed of that was even possible, right? But now look what happened. A bunch of people got together and innovated and created the possible, right?
Yeah.
So that's, to me, is what innovation is. It's what can you do to change the world, change society, make it better, right? That, to me, is innovation. And we're doing that too. So I also encourage people to look up Adobe Kickbox. If you just Google Adobe Kickbox,
okay,
that's a good example of how you can do innovation at the corporate level. And so innovation can come from anybody. Anybody in the company can do that, right? And we know that Facebook and Google does these hackathons and innovation days and all that cool stuff, right? And it's a similar thing, that you've got to create an environment where innovation happens, and you use the right people and skills, and you have an environment that helps that innovation happen, right? It's more than psychological safety. I mean, that's important. But you've got to create an environment where everyone wants to innovate, and that's an intrinsic motivator. So look at Dan Pink, intrinsic motivators. To me, that is a major intrinsic motivator for the newer generation coming up. So when I talk to the millennials and the next generation, it's all about working for companies that makes a social, cultural difference and innovates.
Certainly. Great. I really like the way with which you explained it. And the last question is, I'm very impressed while I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, and you mentioned that you always like to learn. As I see your LinkedIn profile, I noticed that as recently as in June, you had done a course or certification in design thinking. And that's really such an amazing thing. After 40 years of experience, you are still ready to earn new certification and learn something new. Tell us something little bit about design thinking and how that is going to be one of the key skills or key areas, especially for the agile practitioners going forward.
Sure. I like design. Another component of that is called service design. So you can look that up too. Um, some of the stuff we've been doing for a while, it's kind of formalized a little bit with IDEO and Stanford. So I kind of started from Stanford and IDEO. Now there's a lot of design schools out there that you can learn from, and now MIT and all of them are teaching it, right? But it's kind of cool in the sense that it is all about ideation and working through a problem and then coming up with a hypothesis. So what I like about this is those who are science majors, this is scientific thinking. Okay. You come up with a hypothesis and you try to prove or disprove the hypothesis. And you go through this simple process to do that. What Google does, they created these design sprints to do this, right? They're 5 days to come up with a prototype, right? And then we do Wizard of Oz prototypes, so forth, to go get some data from the customer to determine what we should do and go forward, right? There's other things you can do. But I like the notion of the design sprint because I personally like using that on the innovation side, on the product discovery side, right? So it's just a practice or technique you can use. There's others, right? But I like using that because it does kind of take people through a process of how to ideate and then come up with conversion, divergent themes and processes, and then hook it all together. Jeff Gotthive, has done this in his book too, and talked about how to apply this from a UX point of view, and he has a way to do it, right? And there's several others out there that have these canvases, not as canvases anymore, right?
Yeah.
Where you can follow this process, right? So I've used this at a few companies and teams, and we solved some problems, right? Or we came up with some new ideas for a product enhancement or a new product area. And then we'd go out and do market analysis and ethnography. So you can look that up. So ethnography, we go to the customer and we actually there in their house and see how they do stuff for their business and so forth. And we learn from that. It's an anthropology, cultural anthropology type of technique and practice. So now what I see is that we're kind of figuring this out. We're kind of blending this together to see, depending on what problem we're solving or what innovation we're trying to bring to the market, we use these techniques to help us determine how to go forward.
Oh, okay, great. I'm sure for any agile transformation person, this design thinking gives a very different perspective of looking at it, especially convergent and divergent thinking really expands his horizon, I must say.
Yeah, well, it's different. Well, think about it. It's different because most of us, at least in my background and past, we're on a project, we're on a team, we're coding, we're trying to get stuff done. We got deadlines and dates. We got to change this code. We got to test this, push this code out. Okay. But most of us don't go to a team and say, hey, we have a problem. We need to solve world hunger. Let's think about it. Now, what are we going to do? What solutions can we bring? Right? And that's where design thinking comes in. But hey, think about this. I got to have people in my organization, in my company. And there's generally the product leaders, product business people, as well as the technology people. They have to be able to go off. Some people, I don't know who they are, have to be able to go off from all this other work we used to do to think and go through the problem solving process to come up with ideas that we can really execute on. That's hard. Think about it. In an organization, who's going to do that? And how do I pick the people that are going to do that? Right? And what skills do they need? What capabilities do they need?
Great. Yeah, very important. Jay, thank you so much for all sharing your great knowledge and experiences and ideas with us. I'm sure all my audience of this podcast would love your video, and of course, we also release this as an audio. Thank you so much again for being here and accepting my request to be part of my guest. And I'm really looking forward to talk with you again after a few days in another episode of this podcast. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, share, and subscribe to this podcast and to this YouTube channel. Thank you.